Hello there, welcome to my guide for painting the Yub Nub Star Wars Shatterpoint set. So as you can see, I haven't glued everything to their bases. This is going to make things a lot easier when painting, but I have sprayed all of the Ewoks and R2 with some matte white spray, and I've also sprayed C-3PO with some matte black spray. Both these sprays are from Colourforge. So I'm then going to paint a couple of the Ewoks with some Catachan flesh. Now it's up to you if you sort of paint the same models, but I'm going to be basically painting different models, sort of the same colours, but so they stand out separately on the battlefield. Then the next Ewok I paint, I'll be using some Xandri dust. Once again, I'm going to be painting two of these guys. And then for Wicket's fur, I'm going to be using some Gothor brand for the vast majority of it. But for his face and his belly, I'm going to be using a little bit of Wraithbone. I'm also going to use the Wraithbone to paint Logray, the Medicine Man, as well. I'm then going to wash all those Ewoks we've painted so far with some Army Painter Soft Tone. The last two Ewoks are going to get painted with some Admin Grey. I'm then going to use some Apothecary White to give them a quick wash, and I'm also going to use it to paint the entirety of R2. While those washes dry, I'm going to move on to C-3PO. I'm going to paint the vast majority of his body with some Retributor armor. Make sure that you leave one leg, as that leg will be silver later on. Then he'll get a wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. Once those washes have dried, I'm then going to go back to the Catachan Flesh, and I'm going to re-dry brush the Catachan Flesh on there, obviously taking care to avoid any of the recesses. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Catachan Flesh and Knight's Quester Flesh for the next highlight. Then for the last highlight, we're just going to use some Knight's Quester Flesh, and this is a lot lighter dry brush. We're just trying to pick out the more finer details and finer hairs on the models. Next up, going back to the Xandri dust once again, we're going to relayer the Xandri dust by dry brushing it on. And then for the highlight, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Xandri dust and Screaming Skull. Then going back to Wicket, we're first going to dry brush him with some Gothor Brown. This is then followed by a 50-50 mix of Gothor Brown and Wraithbone for the second highlight. Then I use some Wraithbone to start painting Logray. I think this is probably pronouncing that wrong, so I do apologise for any Star Wars fanatics out there. I'm terrible with names. But anyway, use some Wraithbone to dry brush on him, just to brighten up the colours a little. And this was followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and matte white. I also used it to dry brush Wicket's face and his little belly. Moving on to the Admin Grey, I then used some Grey Seer for a dry brush. This was then followed on by a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and matte white. And then lastly, matte white just by itself, but this is a very, very light dry brush as we want to keep the majority of the grey showing. I stayed with the matte white and I dry brushed R2, all his white areas. Be very careful with this, you don't want to push too hard as you don't want to cover up the vast majority of the detail, but it will take a little while to sort of cover him correctly. Sticking with the dry brushing and getting all out of the way, we're going to move on to C-3PO. We're going to dry brush on the Retributor armor. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Retributor armor and Uruk armor gold. Then Uruk armor gold just by itself, with each successive highlight as well, becoming more and more gentle as we're trying just to start to catch all of the more subtle details. Then finally we're going to add a little bit of Stormhost Silver to the Uruk Armor Gold for about a 70-30 split in favour of Uruk Armor Gold for one final dry brush. Lurkway has some stripes on his fur, so what we're going to use is we're going to use a little bit of Baneblade Brown, and we're going to keep it nice and thin so some of that Wraithbone shines through. Then to paint all the feet and the tootsies and the fingers, we're going to use a little bit of Kislev flesh. The flesh will then receive a wash with some Reichland flesh shade. Now moving on to the cloth, for the darker colours or any darker colours you want to use, I'm going to start with some Dryad bark. I'm also going to paint the same colour onto Lurkway's cloth as well. I'm going to follow that up with a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Gothel brown. I'm skipping the wash on these guys as I've done some Ewoks before, and I prefer to do these guys without the wash, just in case you were wondering. Next up will be that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Gothel brown. Then lastly, I'm going to do Gothel brown just by itself as an edge highlight. Next, we're going to paint any greyish hoods and clothing with a little bit of Dark Reaper. And to highlight that, we'll use a 50-50 mix of Dark Reaper and Matte White. This is then followed by that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Matte White. And then one final mix of the same mix, but this time it's going to be a 90-10 ratio, heavily in favour of Matte White, and it's just going to be an edge highlight. Moving on to the final hoods, I'm going to start with a base coat of Mournfang Brown. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown. Then Scrag Brown just by itself. And then finally an edge highlight of a 50-50 mix of Scrag Brown and Matte White. I'm then going to finish off all of the skin by using a little bit of Kislev flesh just to simply relayer all of those areas, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. Then I'm going to start painting all their lips with a little bit of Dryad bark. I'm then going to paint their nose and their eyes with some Abaddon black. Then the nose we're going to highlight with a little bit of Corvus black. From there I'm going to start painting all of the weapons, and I'm going to be using some Steel Legion drab to paint the staffs, or the spears I should say, plus some of the bandages around them. However, it won't be every single bit of bandages around them. I'm going to use some Wraithbone to paint just various ones. I'm going to just pick and choose randomly which ones I'm going to paint, but some of those badges will be painted with some Wraithbone. I'm also going to use that Wraithbone to paint sort of the little sewing patches that are on one of the Ewoks' headdress. Keep your eye out for any little bones that are on these guys. There's quite a few and they're dotted around everywhere, but for those I'm going to use some Morghast bone. Then lastly, I'm going to use some Carrick Stone to paint any rope that's dotted around these guys. There's not much of it, but do keep a lookout for them. Then I'm going to give the bones, the bandages, and the rope a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. Once our wash is dried, I'm then going to use some Baneblade Brown to give all these spears a quick highlight. Then for the bandages that I painted with some Steel Legion Drab, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Steel Legion Drab and Baneblade Brown just to give them a quick highlight. Moving on to the bone, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Morecast bone and Wraith bone for the first highlight. And this will be followed by Wraith bone just by itself. To paint any threads on the headdresses, I'm going to use a little bit of Dryad bark. And this will get highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Blanebraid brown. To paint any of the feathers, I'm going to start with a base coat of Grey Seer. These will then be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Matte White. And then a final highlight of Matte White just by itself. Then to paint the tips of the spears and the blades of the knife, I'm going to start with a base coat of Dawnstone. They'll then be highlighted with a quick dry brush of some Admin Grey. Now with the Ewoks out of the way, I'm going to move on to C-3PO. I'm going to paint the inside of his waist with a little bit of Abaddon Black. Then for any red wires, I'm going to start with some Mephiston Red. And they'll be highlighted with some Wild Rider Red. And for the blue wires, I will start with a base coat of Macragge Blue, followed by a highlight of Calgar Blue. His eyes are yellow, so we'll start with a base coat of Avalan Sunset. And to give it a little bit of depth, we're going to use a tiny bit of Cassandori Yellow. To paint his silver leg, we'll start with a base coat of Iron Hand Steel. And don't forget to also paint any silver areas on R2, mostly his dome. That silver will then be washed with some Nuln Oil. To start the highlighting process, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormhost Silver. And this will be followed by Stormhost Silver just by itself. So here comes the most tedious and hardest task of this whole painting session. Make sure you use a nice thin brush for this, but for all of the blue on R2, I'm going to be using some Techless Blue. Use the smallest brush and take your time with this. Any mistakes can be cleaned up later. To highlight all that blue, we're first going to use a 50-50 mix of Techless Blue and Matte White. And this will be followed by that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Matte White, and this is more of just an edge highlight. To paint his eye or lens, I'm going to start with a base coat of Abaddon Black. This will be followed by a little bit of Corvus Black. And then finally a tiny dot of Matte White to represent a little reflection. This next step you can skip if you wish, but I want my guys to be sort of in a more forest area rather than concrete. So I'm going to put a coating of the technical paint Stirland Mud. Once that had dried, I then use some wild wood to paint any of the broken tree branches or wood. This was followed by Dryad Bark to touch up any of the other areas that will be mud. And then Dawnstone to paint any exposed rocks. Any greenery was then painted with a little bit of Deathworld Forest. All of that, including the wood, was then dry brushed with a little bit of Carrick Stone. Finally, for the painting at least, I then used a little bit of Abaddon Black just to tidy up the rims and to make them all uniform with all my rest of my Star Wars Shatterpoint stuff. This is basically the next bit is up to you on how you base your guys. For me, I used some PVA glue and a little bit of static grass, some green static grass. Then I glued everything to their bases to basically finish off the models. That's then this squad finished. I've got to say, I didn't love painting them. They were okay. There were kind of like a few details were a little bit too sort of backwards and forwardsy, if that makes sense. So sometimes I go, oh, that's a bone, and they go, oh, actually, it seems to be a feather. But overall, I'm happy with the result. They didn't take too long either. They only came in roughly around about sort of 9 hours for the lot. If you followed this guide and you found it useful, please give the channel a subscribe and the video a like. It really does help sort of things get noticed on YouTube. YouTube's a bit weird, as it normally is, as I'm starting to discover as I start to grow. But yeah, I really do hope it helped. I really do hope you liked the video as well. And if you want to see more, we've got other sort of games on here as well, including Marvel Crisis Protocol, 40k, all that sort of good stuff. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and goodbye for now.